The locks were changed while you were gone. I figured you'd figure it out eventually.
You burned my father's toolbox.
I cleared out what you left behind. Call it whatever you want.
Mara.
The house is mine. The company is mine. We're done here.
I heard you.
Don't bother coming back!
I won't.
Good. You never belonged here anyway.
The moment I got back to my car and checked our joint accounts, I understood exactly why she'd picked this day. She expected me to leave quietly. But what happens when the man you just locked out tracks financial risk for a living, and he just started paying attention? If you've ever had someone try to erase your name from a story you helped write, stay with this one. It doesn't end the way she planned. And if this kind of content speaks to you, subscribing takes 2 seconds and it means a great deal. I drove with both hands on the wheel and nothing playing on the radio. The streetlights were still on because it was barely past 6 in the morning, and the roads through Burlington's east side were mostly empty. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to put distance between myself and the smoke still rising from that steel drum, and between myself and the sound of Mara's voice delivering 9 years of marriage like a lease termination notice. I turned north, then west, then north again, the kind of aimless driving you do when your body knows it needs to move, but your mind hasn't caught up yet. Mara and I had met at a fundraiser in Boston back when I was still consulting for a regional bank and she was selling custom residential pieces out of a rented studio space in Cambridge. She had opinions about everything about the event, about the catering, about the fact that nobody in the room seemed to actually know why they were there. I found that funny. I found her funny. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Vermont. And when she told me she wanted to build something of her own, something with her name on it, I told her I'd help her do it. That was not a complicated decision. She was talented, she was driven, and I believed in her in the uncomplicated way you believe in someone when the relationship is still young enough that you haven't yet learned which parts of them will eventually surprise you. Lumen Row Interiors started with a studio on Pearl Street, a line of credit drawn against our joint account and roughly 60-hour weeks from both of us. Her designing, me managing the books, negotiating lease terms and building cash flow projections at midnight after my own workday was already done. The money I'd saved before the marriage went into the second studio when the first one outgrew itself. When Lumen Row won its first major contract, a full hotel renovation in Stowe that landed them a feature in a regional design publication. Mara cried in our kitchen and said she couldn't have done it without me. I remember that moment with the specificity you remember things that later become evidence of something you missed. She meant it when she said it. That part I'm still certain of. Somewhere in the following years, the story she told herself about Lumen Row quietly changed. The client list grew, the revenue doubled, and the version of the company's origin that included my credit line, my midnight spreadsheets, and my signature on the initial lease agreements began to fade from the version she presented at industry dinners. It didn't happen through any single decision. It was the kind of gradual revision that's invisible while it's in progress, the way a building shifts on its foundation over years before anything cracks. And by the time you notice the gap in the wall, the foundation has already moved. That was around the time Colin Voss arrived. He came in as Director of Business Development about 18 months ago, recruited through a creative talent firm Mara had been working with for sourcing senior hires. I met him twice in person, once at a company dinner she brought me to near the start of his tenure, and once when he stopped by the house to drop off documents she'd left at the office. Both times he was measured, professional, and careful in a way that had nothing to do with courtesy. He chose his words the way people choose words when they've learned that careless conversation costs money. He wasn't unfriendly, he was precise. And the thing about precision is that it's easy to mistake it for trustworthiness until you understand what it's actually being used to protect. Colin had looked at Lumen Row and seen what it was going to become before most people in the room understood where it already was. He had done his own version of a projection market position brand trajectory growth curve, and he had decided where he wanted to be standing when that curve peaked. What he needed was access to the company without the legal complexity of a married co-founder's financial history running through its foundation. He needed Mara without the part of Mara that was still legally connected to me. He understood that the fastest way to get that was not to take something from anyone, but to help Mara believe she was simply taking back what had always been hers. I don't think he was ever dishonest with her about who he was. I think she just chose to see what she wanted to see, and he was careful never to correct her. I had noticed the shift in our marriage about a year ago. Mara stopped mentioning my name at company events. She began using passwords I didn't know on accounts we had shared access to for years. When I raised it, she said I was being territorial. When I pressed, she said she had her life and I had mine, and that people who understood each other gave each other room. I didn't push back the way I probably should have. I work in financial risk assessment. I spend my days identifying the gap between what a situation appears to be on the surface and what's actually happening underneath the numbers. I was doing that work in conference rooms across New England for other companies. I was apparently doing very little of it at home. The trip to Quebec City was supposed to be 4 days. The client engagement wrapped early. Both parties reached an agreement in the final session faster than the timeline had anticipated, and I rebooked a flight home without thinking much of it. I considered texting Mara to let her know I was coming back early, and then decided not to. I told myself I wanted to surprise her. That was the word I used to myself in the airport, standing in the departure line with my carry-on and my laptop case. Surprise. What I pulled up to on Red Maple Court was a rental dumpster sitting behind the garage, still producing a thin column of smoke in the cold morning air. I sat in the car for a moment and looked at it through the windshield. I ran through the explanations that would make it something other than what it was. Renovation debris, old furniture, junk from the garage we'd talked about clearing out. There were no explanations. I got out, walked over, and looked inside. The leather handle of my father's toolbox was still partially recognizable in the ash. The brass latch he had replaced himself sometime in the 1980s had melted into something dark and formless, sitting on top of what had been his handsaw and his levels and the folding ruler he'd used since before I was born. The photographs were gone. The vinyl records I'd been collecting since my early 20s were gone. The books I'd carried from apartment to apartment for 15 years were gone. Everything that had been mine in a specific and irreplaceable way was ash. Mara was standing on the front step when I turned around. She was wearing her work clothes. She looked like someone who had already moved through the difficult part of a necessary task and was now simply waiting for the final administrative step to complete. She told me the locks had been changed. She told me the house was hers and the company was hers and the marriage was over. She said all of it without inflection, without hesitation, without the smallest acknowledgement that the man standing in her driveway had once stayed up until 2 in the morning finishing a cash flow model so she could walk into a meeting with a clear picture of what she needed to ask for. I took photographs of the dumpster, of the ash, of the new lock panel. Then I got back in my car. I made it about 6 blocks before I pulled into an empty lot near the riverbank and cut the engine. The lot sat behind a marine supply warehouse that wasn't open yet. Seagulls were moving across the concrete in the gray morning light, and the river beyond the chain-link fence was flat and the color of old pewter. I sat there and did not reach for my phone. I did not start building a legal strategy in my head. I did not do any of the things I was trained by 20 years of professional habit to do when a situation required rapid assessment. I just sat there in a car that still had my Quebec City parking receipt on the passenger seat, and I let myself understand what was actually gone. My father had owned that toolbox for longer than I'd been alive. He was a civil engineer by training, but he fixed everything himself: the plumbing, the electrical, the drywall, the transmission on the truck. He drove for 11 years past the point anyone sensible would have replaced it. He kept every tool sorted by type in tray inserts he'd cut from pine board himself. And when I was about 9 years old, he started showing me where each one went and what it was for. Not as a formal lesson, just as the ordinary thing you do when a kid is standing next to you and you want them to feel useful. That box had moved with me through 4 apartments and eventually into the house on Red Maple Court. It had been in the garage there for 6 years. Mara knew what it was. She had held the other end of it when we carried it up from the moving truck on the day we moved in. I sat in that lot for 15 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and drove to find somewhere to work. The co-working facility near the waterfront ran around the clock. I'd used it twice before when I had overseas clients and needed to make calls in the early hours without waking Mara. I signed in with my keycard, took a private office on the second floor, poured coffee from the machine in the hallway, and opened my laptop. I logged into every financial account that still carried my name, including a shared cloud storage folder Mara had apparently forgotten. I still had credentials from the years when I managed the company's early financial documents. I was not expecting what I found across those accounts, but I recognized it immediately for what it was. In the 36 hours before my flight landed back in Burlington, a sequence of transactions had been initiated across 4 separate accounts. A transfer of $680,000 had been staged out of our joint investment portfolio, not yet completed, held in a 48-hour clearing window, but approved from Mara's credentials and ready to move. A request to change the managing member designation on the LLC that held our lake house property had been filed with the state, replacing our joint listing with Mara's name alone. A separate transfer from a Lumen Row operating account to an account I didn't recognize had already cleared. And in the shared cloud storage folder, there were the early documents of a refinancing application on the house on Red Maple Court initiated 3 days before she ever said a word to me about ending the marriage. The unrecognized account traced back to a business entity I had never heard of. I ran the name through the state's corporate registry. The entity had been incorporated 11 days ago. There were 2 members listed. Mara was the first. Colin Voss was the second. I read that twice. Then I called Talia Brenner. Talia had been a family law attorney in Burlington for more than 20 years. She had been recommended to me once offhandedly by a colleague who said she was the kind of attorney you wanted if the situation became complicated, not because she was combative, but because she was relentlessly precise. I had saved her number in my phone under her full name and never expected to use it. It was just before 7 in the morning when I called. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Her first question before I had finished describing what I'd come home to was whether I had photographs of the ash. She didn't ask whether I was all right. She didn't offer condolences or ask how long we'd been having problems. She wanted to know about documentation. I told her I had photographs of the dumpster, the ash, the new lock panel, and the timestamp from my phone showing when they were taken. She said good. Then she said what else. I walked her through the financial transactions. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, the silence that followed felt like someone sorting through a large amount of information very quickly, rather than someone deciding how to feel about it. Talia had been through her own divorce. I would learn later, handled by someone else, not herself, which she said was the only sane way to do it, and she had come out of it with a clear-eyed understanding of how asset movement worked in the hours before a marriage formally ended. She didn't treat what I was describing as surprising. She treated it as a pattern she recognized. She explained the legal framework plainly. Property destruction taken alone might be processed as a domestic conflict within the divorce proceedings, damaging to Mara's position, but not necessarily a basis for urgent court action. What changed the analysis was the combination physical destruction paired with financial transactions that had been initiated before Mara had said anything to me about her intentions. That sequence pointed to something more deliberate than an angry spouse clearing out a house. It pointed to a coordinated effort to restructure assets before I could respond. And the new entity with Colin Voss as co-managing member, funded partially with money that had moved from accounts with my name on them, gave a court a specific and concrete thing to examine. Talia said she could file for an emergency asset preservation order that morning. If granted, it would freeze all pending transfers, lock the status of jointly held properties, and prevent either party from making unilateral changes to shared financial positions until the court reviewed the situation. She asked me if I wanted to do that. I told her yes without hesitation. She said she'd have a status update by afternoon, and before she ended the call, she said something that has stayed with me since courts don't make decisions based on who suffered more. They make decisions based on who can document more. She said it without any particular softness, not as reassurance, just as a fact about how the process worked. I appreciated the precision. Sympathy would not have helped me that morning. I poured a second coffee and pulled the transaction records back up on the screen. 9 years. The full span of what we had built together, not just the house, not just the investment accounts, but the specific texture of a life that had included real collaboration and real sacrifice from both sides, and it had apparently taken 11 days to begin dismantling. 11 days from the date the new entity was filed to the morning. Mara stood on the front step and told me I no longer lived there. Something shifted in me in that room, and it was not grief exactly. It was something more like recalibration, the feeling of a system resetting to a more accurate set of assumptions after operating on faulty data. I had driven away from Red Maple Court still carrying some residual version of a question I'd been circling for months, whether the marriage could be repaired, whether some conversation we hadn't yet had could still matter. That question dissolved when I saw Colin Voss's name on a state registry document funded partly with money from an account I had co-signed. I was not going to try to save the marriage. I was going to make sure that by the time this process ended, every dollar that had moved, every asset that had been reclassified, every decision made in those 11 days would have to be explained in writing to a judge. Not out of revenge, I thought about that distinction deliberately and specifically that morning. Revenge would have meant wanting Mara to lose everything. What I wanted was simpler, and I believed more accurate. I did not want to be erased from the history of something I had helped build. The things she had burned could not come back. The toolbox couldn't come back. The photographs of my father standing in front of the house he had built with his own hands were ash now, and nothing the court did would change that. But the financial record of what we had built together, the loan documents, the account statements, the wire transfers, the late deposits I had made into Lumen Rowe's accounts during the years when she was still thanking me for making them. That record existed in servers and regulatory filings and bank archives, and it could not be lit on fire. Talia called back at 3 in the afternoon. The filing had been reviewed. The order was granted. I sat with that for a moment in the quiet of the second-floor office Burlington, going about its ordinary afternoon below the window, completely indifferent to the fact that somewhere across town, a series of transactions that had been staged with careful timing had just become legally immovable. The pending transfer of $680,000 was frozen. The Lake House LLC change was suspended. The new entity's ability to receive further transfers from Lumen Rowe operating funds was blocked pending court review. Mara had lit the match and changed the lock and spent 11 days building a structure designed to leave me with nothing. She had done all of it before saying a single word to me about wanting out of the marriage. And she had done it under the assumption that the man she was locking out of his own house was too emotionally overwhelmed, too far away, or too slow to look at the accounts in time to matter. I didn't break a door. I didn't make a threat. I didn't do anything I wasn't prepared to stand behind in a courtroom. I took photographs of the ash I drove to a co-working space, and I called a lawyer who asked the right questions in the right order. The assets were frozen. And now, whatever Mara and Colin Voss had planned for the life they'd arranged before I got home, they were going to have to explain every piece of it to someone who would be taking notes. The freeze order held overnight, but holding overnight and holding through a formal legal response are two different things. Talia had told me that clearly when we spoke the afternoon the order was granted. She said Mara would almost certainly move to challenge it probably within 72 hours. And that the strength of what we had filed would be tested not by the initial judge who approved it, but by whoever reviewed the full record once Mara's attorneys submitted their opposition. That was the part that mattered. The first order was a door being shut quickly in an emergency. What came next would determine whether it stayed shut. Mara's attorneys filed their response in less than 48 hours. The document was thorough in the way that documents are thorough when they've been partially prepared in advance. That detail was not lost on me. A response of that depth and specificity, addressing the asset freeze across multiple accounts, articulating a legal theory for each contested item, and including a character framing of my motivations, doesn't get drafted in 2 days from scratch. Some version of it had been sitting in a file somewhere waiting. Talia said as much when she sent me the opposition filing with a short note attached. They were ready for this, and that mattered. It was exactly the kind of observation I'd paid her to make. The core of Mara's legal position was built on 4 claims, each designed to neutralize a different piece of what we had filed. She asserted that Lumen Rowe Interiors had always been her separate property, established before the marriage had any financial entanglement with the business. She maintained that my contributions, the credit line, the transferred bonuses, The mortgage-secured expansion funding had been informal gifts made freely during the marriage and carried no legal claim on the company's current value. She characterized the items destroyed in the dumpster as property I had abandoned by leaving the residence voluntarily on the morning in question. And she described the financial transactions as routine business operations conducted within her authority as sole managing member of Lumen Ro's operating accounts. Each of those claims taken individually was defensible. Together, they built a version of the story in which I was an estranged husband attempting to weaponize a divorce proceeding against a woman who had simply decided to move on. The weakness in what she had filed was what it didn't address. It said nothing specific about the email that instructed the Lumen Ro accounting department to complete the transfer before I returned from Quebec City. It said nothing about the timeline between the new entity's formation and the day she changed the locks. It described Colin Voss's role in the new business entity as a standard strategic partnership, without explaining why that partnership required moving money out of an existing operating account on a 48-hour window timed around my travel schedule. Talia read those silences as clearly as I did. She said that absence was useful, but only if we could fill in what they were omitting. That was when the evidence collection became something more systematic. The neighbor 3 houses east of Red Maple Court had a security camera mounted above her garage door, angled to cover her driveway and approximately 40 feet of the street in both directions. I had helped her install it 2 years ago after a package theft incident on the block. She gave Talia consent to review the footage without requiring a formal request. The recording from the morning in question showed a commercial moving company vehicle parked in front of the house, beginning at 8 in the morning, more than an hour before I landed at Burlington International Airport on my rerouted flight. 2 workers carried items out of the garage and the side entrance. Mara was visible in the frame 3 separate times directing the process. Colin Voss's vehicle pulled into the driveway at 4:17 in the afternoon within an hour of my departure from the property. He went inside. He was there for the remainder of the footage window. The smart lock system on the front door of Red Maple Court was registered to a shared account that still included my credentials, because Mara had evidently not thought to remove me from the device's administrative backend, only from the access code itself. The system log showed that my personal access code had been invalidated at 7:49 in the morning, 11 minutes before the moving company vehicle appeared on the neighbor's camera at 8. That timestamp placed the decision to revoke my physical access to the house at the exact moment the removal operation was beginning, not after I had arrived and created a conflict. The sequence confirmed what the transaction records already suggested. None of what happened that morning was a reaction to something I had done. It had been scheduled. Talia added both pieces of evidence to our filing. Then she found the email. It had been forwarded to us through Discovery, which the freeze order compelled Mara to cooperate with at least partially in the preliminary phase. The message had been sent from Mara's business account to the head of Lumen Ro's internal accounting 3 days before I came home. The relevant line read, "Complete the transfer authorization before G returns. I'll explain the structure after." The initial was unambiguous in context. Talia said that a single internal email was rarely determinative on its own, but that in combination with the formation date of the new entity, the transaction timing, and the smart lock log, it assembled something a judge would have to take seriously. It replaced the narrative of an impulsive, angry spouse with the narrative of a coordinated sequence. Those were not the same thing legally, and they were not the same thing in terms of how a court would evaluate what had happened to the freeze order. 4 days after the assets were frozen, Mara and Colin went to the bank together. I wasn't there, obviously. What I know about that morning came from Talia's contact at the title company that held the Lake House property, who confirmed the attempted transaction had been flagged and declined. The refinancing application had been submitted as a joint action, but the freeze order had placed a hold on any disposition of property listed in the filing. The bank could not proceed. According to the title contact, the 2 of them had been at the window for nearly 20 minutes before a manager came out to explain what was in the system. They left without completing anything. What Mara described later in a conversation I'll get to was that they sat in Colin's car in the bank parking lot for a few minutes afterward. She said he didn't raise his voice. He asked her one question, whether she had been certain about the legal status of the founding capital. She told him she had handled it. He said he believed her, and then he looked out the passenger window and didn't say anything else. Mara told me this months later as part of explaining why she had started to realize in that parking lot that Colin was not actually standing next to her in the way she had understood. He was standing adjacent to the asset position he had calculated she controlled. When the asset position became uncertain, the geometry of where he was standing shifted without him having to take a single step. The precision she had found reassuring about him had never been directed at protecting her. It had always been directed at protecting the calculation. She called me the same evening, the first time we'd spoken since the morning on the front step. I was in the kitchenette of the co-working space, eating something I had bought at the deli across the street when my phone showed her name on the screen. I answered. Her voice was tight in the specific way that anger sounds when it's covering something underneath it that the person isn't willing to name yet. She said I had frozen her entire life over a pile of burned furniture. I told her it wasn't about the furniture. I told her it was about the fact that she had initiated those financial transactions before she had said a single word to me about ending the marriage. She didn't respond to that directly. She said I was punishing her. I said the court was not punishing anyone, yet it was simply requiring that the positions stay fixed while the record was reviewed. She ended the call before I had finished the sentence. What she did next was the part that caught me off guard, not because it was surprising in strategy, but because of the specific form it took. Mara began talking. She talked to Lumen Row employees about the marriage breakdown, framing it as the result of years of financial control she had endured from a husband who had never genuinely supported her independence. She talked to professional contacts, to vendors, to people she and I had both known for years in Burlington's business community. She described the freeze order as an act of economic retaliation by an estranged spouse who was trying to destroy what she had built because he couldn't accept that she had outgrown the marriage. She was not subtle about using my professional context as part of the framing. She mentioned in more than one conversation that I worked in financial risk assessment, the implication being that a man with that background had weaponized his technical knowledge to harm her business unfairly. It reached my employer within 2 weeks. Not in a formal way, no complaint was filed, no HR process was initiated. But a senior partner at the consulting firm I worked for called me into a meeting and told me with visible discomfort that one of our larger institutional clients had flagged awareness of my personal legal situation and expressed concern about my involvement in a sensitive ongoing engagement with a healthcare network's investment portfolio. He said they were not making any determination about my character or conduct. They were, however, asking that I step back from that specific engagement pending resolution of the personal matter. He used the phrase optics of neutrality twice. I thanked him for telling me directly and left the meeting. Talia had warned me that this kind of move was possible. She had said that people who have sophisticated help tend to fight in multiple arenas, simultaneously, legal, financial, social, professional, because spreading the pressure is more effective than concentrating it. She was right, and knowing she was right did not make sitting across from a senior partner and listening to the phrase optics of neutrality feel like anything other than what it was. It was Mara finding a way to make the cost of holding my ground material and immediate and connected to the part of my life that had nothing to do with her. It was a very effective thing to do. Then her attorneys produced the financial agreement. It had been signed 4 years into the marriage when Lumen Row was beginning its first significant expansion phase, and Mara had been advised by her business attorney to formalize the ownership structure of the company separately from our marital estate. At the time I had read it, consulted briefly with an attorney who told me it was standard for a spousal business operating independently of the marriage, and signed it. It was 2 pages. One clause specifically defined Lumen Row Interiors as Mara's separate property established prior to the marriage's financial entanglement and maintained as such through the formal designation. That clause, her attorneys argued, invalidated the premise of our freeze filing. If the company was legally separate, then the movement of funds within the company's accounts was not marital asset dissipation. It was internal business management. And if the company was separate, then the value. Talia had been arguing accrued from joint contributions was attributable to a separate property asset, not a marital one. Talia called me with the news on a Tuesday afternoon. She didn't lead with reassurance. She said, "You signed it and it's valid." Then she said she needed to see me in person to go through the implications, and she asked if I could come to her office that evening. I arrived at 7. She was still at her desk with 2 folders open and a paper bag from the sandwich place on Church Street sitting next to her keyboard. She handed me half a turkey sandwich without preamble and said she'd also forgotten to eat. We sat on opposite sides of her desk and went through the document clause by clause while the building emptied out around us and the light through the office windows went from orange to gray to dark. The situation as Talia laid it out was not catastrophic, but it was materially worse than where we had been 48 hours earlier. If Mara's attorneys could persuade the reviewing judge that the financial agreement effectively excluded Lou Monroe from the marital estate, then the portion of the freeze order that applied to the company's accounts and the new entity's initial capitalization could be lifted. That would restore Mara's ability to move money through Lou Monroe, complete the structure she and Colin had been building, and potentially absorb or reclassify some of the assets that were currently locked while the divorce proceedings were still open. It wouldn't undo the freeze entirely. The jointly held properties and the investment portfolio were on separate footing, but it would reduce the scope significantly, and reduction was not what I needed. I needed the full record to be examined before anything moved. Talia spent a long time looking at the agreement, and then at the stack of bank records she had assembled for the case. At some point she looked up and said something. I turned over in my mind for the rest of that evening. She said she didn't want me to think about what Mara had taken. She wanted me to think about what Mara had used to take it. I wasn't sure I understood her immediately, so she was more specific. She said the agreement designated Lou Monroe as separate property. But an asset being separately owned does not mean that the growth of that asset is entirely separate if marital funds contributed materially to its increase in value. The designation covered the company's origin. It said far less about the 6 years of cash that had moved from joint accounts into the company's operations loan draws bonus transfers, the home equity secured expansion line during the period when the company grew from a 2-studio local firm into what it had become. She asked me to think carefully about the specific financial instruments that had been used to fund Lou Monroe's growth years. Not what I remembered generally, but the specific mechanisms which accounts what amounts. What documentation still existed in our joint financial records. I sat there in her office for a few minutes going through it systematically the way I would have gone through it for a client engagement. And as I went through it, I began to see what she was pointing toward. The agreement defined what the company was at the time of signing. It said almost nothing about what the company had been built into using money that was not exclusively Mara's. The distinction was narrow, but it was real, and in the right courtroom with the right documentation, it was the kind of narrow distinction that determined outcomes. I told Talia what I remembered: amounts, account types, approximate timing, and watched her make notes. She said we would need to pull the complete transaction history, which Discovery already entitled us to request. She said it would take time to build, and that the upcoming hearing on the freeze order was our most immediate constraint. She said she was not going to promise me a specific outcome, but that she was going to build the most specific record she could of where every dollar that went into Lou Monroe's growth had originated, and then she was going to present that record to the court and let the judge determine what the agreement's designation clause actually covered. I drove back to the room I was renting near the waterfront that night and sat at the small desk by the window with my laptop open and the transaction records pulled up. The agreement that Mara had presented as the thing that ended the financial argument was signed with my name. But the money that had actually built Lou Monroe into what it was worth arguing over, that was in the records too, and it wasn't hidden. It was in bank statements and loan documents and the specific paper trail of a life that 2 people had built together before one of them decided to light the paper on fire and assume the records had burned with it. They hadn't. The records had not burned. They were in servers and filing cabinets and regulatory archives that no steel drum in any driveway could reach. And the hearing was 2 weeks out. Whatever Mara and Colin had assumed the agreement made permanent, it was about to meet 6 years of financial documentation that told a different version of how Lou Monroe had become worth protecting in the first place. The 2 weeks between that night in Talia's office and the hearing moved the way time moves when you are waiting for something specific slowly during the days and then suddenly gone when you look back at them. I worked. I kept the consulting engagements that remained available to me, managed the ones I could handle remotely, and spent whatever hours were left going through financial records with the methodical attention I had spent 20 years applying to other people's problems. There was something clarifying about applying it to my own. Not satisfying exactly, more like the specific focus that settles over you when the situation stops being ambiguous and becomes something you can actually measure. Talia built the source of funds analysis across 3 weeks of transaction history requests and document pulls. What emerged from that process was a record that the financial agreement Mara had produced could not have anticipated, because when that agreement was signed, most of what it would later be used to protect hadn't yet been built. The agreement designated Lumen Row as separate property based on its status at the time of signing. What it could not retroactively designate was the origin of the capital that had funded the company's growth in the years that followed. The home equity line secured against Red Maple Court. The 6 figures in bonus transfers from my personal accounts that had moved into Lumen Row's operating fund during the expansion into the hotel and commercial contract market. The joint credit facility that had financed the second studio build-out. None of that appeared anywhere in the agreement's language because none of it had happened yet when the agreement was written. It was a document designed to describe a company that was a fraction of the size it eventually became, and it had been presented as though that distinction didn't matter. Talia said the morning before the hearing that she was not going to argue that Mara didn't own Lumen Row. She was going to argue that the version of Lumen Row that existed on the day the divorce was filed was not the same asset the agreement had been written to protect, and that the delta between those two versions had been funded in ways that the court needed to examine before any freeze was lifted or any asset reclassified. She said it plainly without drama, the way she said most things. She had brought 2 copies of the full transaction summary, one for the judge, one for the record, and they ran to 43 pages. The hearing was held in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Chittenden County Courthouse on a Thursday morning in late November. Mara sat at the table to my left with 2 attorneys and a paralegal. She was dressed the way she dressed for important client presentations, composed precise, nothing out of place. She did not look at me when I came in. I did not take that personally. I had spent enough time around high-stakes negotiations to recognize the posture of someone who has decided that eye contact is a liability. Mara's lead attorney opened with the argument they had been building since the opposition filing. Lumen Row was a separately designated asset. The freeze order was an overreach predicated on a disputed claim of marital contribution that the financial agreement explicitly resolved. My motivation in filing for the order was retaliatory rather than protective, driven by the emotional circumstances of a marriage breakdown, rather than any legitimate concern about asset dissipation. The attorney was smooth and organized and presented each point in a sequence designed to make the conclusion feel inevitable. The argument would have been more effective if the email hadn't existed. Talia introduced the transaction history. First, walking the judge through the timeline of capital contributions to Lumen Row from jointly held accounts across the 6 years following the agreement signing. She was specific about amounts and mechanisms, not ranges, not approximations, but the actual figures drawn from the actual records. Then she presented the source of funds analysis, showing how the company's current valuation connected to those capital inputs. She was careful to frame it not as a claim that the agreement was invalid, but as a question the agreement's language had not resolved what happened to the growth funded by money the agreement hadn't accounted for. Then she introduced the email. The judge read it twice. The relevant line, the instruction to complete the transfer authorization before I returned from Quebec City, was 8 words that sat in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable internal accounting message, and those 8 words did what 8 precise words can do in a courtroom when the surrounding evidence has already established the context that makes them legible. Mara's attorney objected on grounds of relevance. The judge overruled the objection and asked for the email to be entered into the record. Talia also entered the smart lock log, the camera footage summary from the neighbor's system, and the state corporate registry filing showing the new entity's formation date 11 days before the morning I came home. What those documents assembled taken together was a sequence. Not a single impulsive act by a wife who had decided she wanted out of a marriage, but a series of coordinated steps, taken in a specific order over a specific window of time, concluding with the revocation of my physical access to the house and the destruction of my personal property, all of it timed around my absence and oriented toward completing a financial restructuring before I could examine the accounts. Mara's attorney argued that the sequence was coincidental, that the business restructuring had been in progress independently, that the timing relative to my travel was not intentional, that the email's phrasing was informal and had been mischaracterized. The judge listened to all of it. Then she said she was not prepared to lift the freeze order in its current scope, and that the situation required deeper examination than a single hearing could provide. She appointed an independent financial expert to review the full record. The expert's mandate was specific: determine which assets were separately held, which had been materially funded by marital contributions, what had been transferred and to where in the 36 hours before I returned from Quebec City, and what the appropriate disposition of each category should be in the context of the divorce proceedings. Until the expert's report was complete and the court had reviewed it, no disposition of the frozen assets would be permitted. The new entity remained blocked from receiving further transfers from Lumen Row operating funds. The Lake House LLC change remained suspended. The pending $680,000 transfer remained frozen. Mara still owned Lumen Row. Nothing that happened in that courtroom changed that, but she no longer controlled the narrative that said everything associated with it was entirely and exclusively hers to move as she chose. That was the thing she had assumed the agreement guaranteed, and the assumption had not survived contact with 43 pages of transaction history, and an 8-word email that someone had thought would never be read by anyone outside the company's internal accounting department. I walked out of the courthouse into the November cold and stood on the steps for a moment while Talia finished gathering her materials inside. The sky was the flat gray of late autumn in Vermont, and the street below was carrying its ordinary Thursday midday traffic. Nothing around me reflected the fact that anything had just happened. That's what courtrooms are like. The decisions made inside them have enormous weight in specific lives and zero visible impact on the world immediately outside the door. I found that oddly settling. It meant the situation was specific and contained, which meant it was manageable. The weeks after the hearing had a different texture than the weeks before it. The immediate urgency had resolved into process the financial expert's review, the documentation requests, the back and forth of discovery that was now moving on a formal schedule with court oversight. I went back to the waterfront room I was renting, continued working the consulting engagements I still had access to, and waited. Talia gave me updates when there was something concrete to report. When there wasn't, she didn't call just to talk, which I appreciated about her. Colin Voss began stepping back from the situation in the weeks after the hearing. It happened in the specific way that someone who has always operated through calculation steps back from a bad position, not dramatically, not with any stated reason, but through a gradual reduction in presence that made its own meaning clear without requiring explanation. He stopped appearing at Lumen Row's office on the days when the legal proceedings required Mara to be there. His name stopped appearing on new correspondence related to the frozen entity. The operational structure they had been building together quietly reconfigured around his absence. From what Talia's contacts in the business community pieced together, he had retained his own attorney to assess his personal exposure related to his co-managing member role in the frozen entity, and that attorney had apparently given him a clear picture of what continued active involvement would look like in the context of an ongoing court-supervised asset review. A decision consistent with every other decision he had ever made. He protected his own position. Whatever Mara had understood his presence to mean, it had always meant that. Shortly after Colin's withdrawal became apparent, Mara called and asked if I would meet her somewhere. Not at the house, it was under a use agreement while the proceedings continued, and not at a lawyer's office. She named a small cafe in a neighborhood just south of downtown that neither of us had any particular history with. I told her I'd be there. She was already seated when I arrived, both hands around a coffee cup, dressed in the kind of low-key way that people who are normally very put-together dress when they want to signal that they're not performing. I ordered coffee at the counter and brought it to the table and sat down. We looked at each other for a moment across a small table in a quiet cafe on a Saturday morning, 9 years of shared history arranged between us. like furniture in a room that was being cleared out. She asked if I had needed to freeze all of it. The question carried the remnant of anger in it, but underneath that was something more fatigued than combative. I told her the same thing I had told her on the phone in October, that she had created the conditions that made it necessary. That a court doesn't impose asset preservation orders on situations where the documentation looks like ordinary marital tension. It imposes them when the documentation looks like what ours looked like. She knew what the documentation looked like. She had written part of it. What she said next surprised me, not in its content, but in the directness of it. She said she had been afraid I would go after the company. She said that fear had been the driving logic behind everything she had done, and that she knew sitting across from me in that cafe that it didn't justify any of it. She said she had started to feel somewhere in the last 2 years that everything she had built was at risk of being reclassified as something we had built together, and that the thought of losing control of Lumen Row had made her want to move faster than the legal process could follow. She had convinced herself that moving fast was the same thing as being decisive. She was saying now that she understood those were not the same thing. I sat with that for a moment. The strange thing about hearing someone explain their reasoning after the damage is already done is that the explanation can be entirely true and entirely insufficient at the same time. I believed her. I believed the fear had been real and that she had made a series of decisions inside that fear that she had justified to herself at each step until the sum of them was a steel drum full of ash in her driveway and an 8-word email in a court record. I believed all of that, and it didn't change what the toolbox looked like when I found it, or what it meant that she had known what it was and done it anyway. I told her that I had never intended to claim the company, that what I had wanted from the first call to Talia at 7 in the morning in that co-working space was not Lumen Row. It was the part of its growth that had been built with money that was partly mine. And more than that, what I had wanted was to not be written out of the history of something I had helped make possible, as though my contribution had been a coincidence rather than a choice. She had tried to move money and restructure ownership and change the record before I had a chance to read it. That was the thing I could not accept. Not the divorce. The attempt to make me a person who hadn't mattered. Mara didn't answer that directly. She looked at her coffee for a long moment and then said she understood the distinction. Whether she did or not in the full sense I meant it, I couldn't know. What I knew was that the conversation was the most honest one we had managed in probably 2 years, and that it was happening across a table in a cafe. Neither of us had any connection to in the middle of a divorce proceeding, which said something about the specific kind of honesty that only becomes available when the stakes of protecting a version of things are finally higher than the stakes of admitting them. The financial expert's report was filed with the court in February. It was detailed and specific in the way that expert reports are when the underlying documentation is complete, which ours was, because Talia had made sure of it. The report identified which components of Lumen Row's current value were attributable to separately held capital and which were attributable to growth funded by marital contributions. It identified the transfer that had already cleared into the frozen entity and recommended that amount be treated as a marital asset subject to equitable division. It recommended the same treatment for the home equity line draw and the transferred bonus capital that had funded the commercial expansion phase. It did not recommend that Mara lose the company. It recommended that the court recognize the full financial history of how the company had become what it was and divide the marital estate accordingly. The divorce was finalized in the spring, several months after the morning I had pulled up to Red Maple Court and seen smoke still rising from a steel drum behind the garage. The division was not punitive. Mara kept Lumen Row. She kept the operational control, the client relationships, the staff. She had built the brand she had started on Pearl Street with money we had both contributed to making available. What she gave up was the fiction that none of that had involved anyone else. The court recognized my proportional share of the growth capital, which translated into an adjusted division of the investment portfolio, the lake house, and a portion of the equity in the marital residence. I did not walk away with everything I'd put in over 9 years. That's not how equitable division works, and it shouldn't be. What I walked away with was the accurate portion. The part a court determined was mine when all of the records had been read by someone whose job was to read them without sentiment. Red Maple Court sold in early summer. I had not been back to the property since the morning I photographed the ash and drove away. I signed the closing documents at the title company's office in a room that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee, and that was the last formal connection to the house. I didn't feel what I expected to feel about it. Mostly, I felt the completion of something that had already been over for a long time before it ended officially. I had found the loft in March before the divorce was finalized in a building that used to be part of a textile warehouse complex along the river's west bank. The ceilings were high and the windows faced south, and the neighborhood had the specific character of places that were industrial before they were residential. Still a little rough at the edges, not yet entirely reclaimed by the kind of renovation that erases what a building used to be. I liked that about it. I moved in with what fit in a rented cargo van, which was not a great deal, and spent the first evening sitting on the floor of a nearly empty room eating takeout from the Thai place 2 blocks over, while the river moved beyond the south-facing windows in the late afternoon light. The loft was quiet in a way the house on Red Maple Court had not been quiet for at least the last 2 years. Not empty quiet. The distinction matters. Empty is absence. Quiet is the condition in which you can hear yourself think without competing with whatever noise a relationship in decline makes, when both people are still occupying the same space but no longer sharing it. A week after I moved in, I was walking back from the hardware store on the far side of the warehouse district. I had gone for painter's tape and a package of light bulbs when I passed the front window of a small tool and equipment resale shop that occupied the ground floor of what had probably been a machine shop in the building's previous life. I slowed down because something in the window display caught my eye, and it took me a moment to understand why. It was a steel tool chest, old style, the kind with a flat lid and a pair of side latches that locked with the key. It was not the same as my father's. The proportions were slightly different. The finish was darker, and the latches were on the wrong side. It was not a replacement, and it was not a replica, and I was not standing there because I thought it could be either of those things. I was standing there because it was a version of a thing I recognized, and recognition, when you've been living in a mostly empty space for a week, has a specific weight to it. I went inside and asked the price. The man behind the counter named a figure that was reasonable, and I carried it back to the loft in both hands, the way you carry something that has actual weight to it, rather than just the weight you're assigning it. I set it in the corner of the main room against the south wall under the window. I stood back and looked at it for a moment. It was not my father's toolbox. It was not a substitute for what had been reduced to ash in that drum. It was a steel box in a corner of a room I was learning to inhabit, and what it represented was not recovery. Recovery is too clean a word for the process of building something again after the original was deliberately destroyed. What it represented was continuation. The decision to acquire tools for a space you intend to use in a life you intend to keep building, even with the full knowledge that some of what was lost will not come back in any form. Mara had tried to solve her fear of losing something by taking everything she could reach before anyone could ask her not to. I understood the fear. I knew it didn't justify anything she had done, and I had stopped trying to reconcile those two true things into a single feeling about her. They didn't reconcile. They existed alongside each other the way most true things about complicated situations do. What I had was a loft with high ceilings, a tool chest in the corner, a view of the river through the south windows, and a professional life I was in the process of rebuilding. I had the part of the financial record that the court had determined was mine. I had a version of the future that I was constructing without reference to what Mara thought it should look like, or what Colin Voss had calculated it was worth, or what either of them had imagined would be left of me after a steel drum and a 48-hour financial restructuring and a changed lock code had done their work. She had burned what she thought would erase the history. She had moved the money she believed was already hers and filed the paperwork she thought would make it permanent. None of it had touched the records. None of it had touched what I actually was or what I was capable of building next. The things Mara had tried hardest to take from me, the financial stake, the professional standing, the version of events those had required months of legal process to protect and recover. The thing she could never have taken regardless of what the freeze order covered or what the financial agreement said was the one that had made all of it possible. The capacity to look at a bad situation clearly and decide without drama what to do next. That capacity had walked out of Red Maple Court with me on the morning she changed the locks. It had been in the parking lot by the river during the 15 minutes I gave myself to feel what I actually felt. It had been on the phone with Talia in the co-working space with the transaction records in the courthouse on the 3rd floor and across the table from a woman who was finally months too late telling the truth. It was in this room now, in this corner next to a second-hand tool chest that was not a replacement for anything, but was a beginning of something. And whatever came next, it would be built from that. If there's anything this story leaves me with, it's something simple that took a long time to understand clearly. When someone tries to take what's yours, not through an argument, not through a conversation, but through a sequence of quiet, calculated moves made while you're not looking, the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm, document everything, and let the record speak. Not because staying calm feels righteous in the moment, it doesn't, but because the person who keeps their head is the person who gets to stay in the room long enough for the truth to surface. Divorce didn't cost me the marriage. That was already gone. What it could have cost me if I had reacted the way Mara expected me to was everything else, the financial stake, the professional reputation, the legal standing. I didn't save those things by being the bigger person in some abstract sense. I saved them by being precise, by calling the right people, and by understanding that a paper trail is harder to burn than a toolbox. Some losses are permanent. I know that now in a way I didn't before that morning. The photographs, the records, the things my father's hands had touched, those are gone and no court order brings them back. But who you are after something like that is yours to decide. Nobody schedules that. Nobody files paperwork to take it from you. It belongs to you as long as you're willing to claim it. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been in a situation where someone tried to rewrite a shared history and call it theirs, consider subscribing to this channel. These are the kinds of stories we tell here. Real situations, real consequences, and the quiet decisions that turn them around. It means a lot to have you here, and there's more coming that I think you'll want to stay for.